Hi friends, my name is Derek. I'm the host of Talking with Fence People. And yesterday during a live stream, a very interesting question slash topic of related to debate came up, and I thought I'd revisit it and what the takeaways were, etc. Because I find it very informative. I found it very informative to me when I was led into this place last night. So there's this expression that some people say that I just don't even understand it at all. Like, you can't derive an ought from an is. Well, what can you derive exactly from an is, and what process of derivation? It's like, regardless, the point is there's this inclination in certain intellectual circles that to believe that because normative claims, which is to say moral claims of some kind, as opposed to descriptive claims like this shirt is green versus it is morally wrong to wear this shirt, there's a sense that somehow normative claims are arbitrary or less real or less provable or testable than descriptive claims. That's absolutely not the case. And the reason people think that's the case is because they say they're assuming, well, you can only derive ought statements if you start with a given axiom, such as people are born owning their own body, or slavery is inherently wicked because of its rights violating, or some sort of axiom like that. But this is very exemplary of what happens when you try to remove something that's a process from the process and treat it as an object of analysis and intellectualize with it as though it were that static object of analysis rather than part of a process. The process of adversarial idea exchange, is a process of using language to parse out that which we affirm from that which we negate. And so the reason why, it's the question of that I just simply do not understand this statement, like you can't derive an is from an ought. Well, sure you can. Like, one ought not steal, therefore it is wrong to steal. That's what one would conclude from the ought statement, of course. There's no reason to conclude that descriptive statements of physicalities are more meaningful than descriptive statements of metaphysicalities. And more importantly, though, this is a great example of why normative arguments are no less definitive or determinate than descriptive arguments or prescriptive arguments if they're done correctly and they validate against the right criteria and stuff. It's because, let's say I'm running a utilitarian framework in a debate round. Say I'm the app. Let's say Joe's the app and he's running a utilitarian framework in a round. That means he's saying we can evaluate the moral status of this simply by predicting impacts and measuring impacts, and if the net benefits to people in general outweigh the harms, then something is morally justified, even if it's rights violating. That's the utilitarian framework in a nutshell. And so the reason why ought statements are just as definitive as descriptive statements is because if Joe's running that utilitarian framework, then I can always run a contingency counter plan that says, look, if he wins the prefer my framework argument, then I want to run this counter plan that is even more extreme than his. So his plan's already extreme in some sense because it's trying to justify the means with the ends. But if it's okay for the goose, it's okay for the gander. In other words, if I then run a framework that says, well, if we're just ignoring rights violations, then why don't we kill all of these people for this predicted good outcome that is gonna, why not have infinite instances of concentrated harm for diffuse good? And if you're gonna buy that framework, Judge, then prefer my counter plan because it makes even more grandiose claims about net benefits to the general populace with even more extreme consequences to individual rights. And if you prefer his framework, then you cannot consider the rights violations in my case because you already said you preferred the framework of his, namely we can evaluate things on a utilitarian calculus. And the point is, whatever your moral framework is, it's something. And if you're making those claims, then I can use that framework against you in an adversarial exchange. As per the example of the contingency counterplan. But more significantly, it's always the case whenever people are making some kinds of advocacies that they're arguing that it's desirable, preferable to the status quo. We have to change the status quo because either this plan addresses harms in the status quo or it creates benefits in the predicted future status quo. Regardless, whether your justifications are prescriptive, which is really what utilitarian justifications are, or whether they're normative, which is what rights-based or legitimacy criteria or legitimacy arguments are, then you're stuck with the fact that if what you say is right, then the following is also right. And if you're wrong, then you discover that your wrongness can get used against you in every instance, because if you say about my counterplan that the rights violations are too horrific for it to be legitimate, well then you've just agreed with me that that's the framework we should be using to evaluate utilitarian plans, in which case your own utilitarian plan will fall victim to the same rights arguments that you're making against my contingency counterplan. At which point, then we're back to preferring my framework, the rights framework. Neither the counterplan nor the aft plan sustains muster under a rights framework because it's rights violating and justifies the ends with the means with the ends. So, I think this is a good example of how, when we're trying to talk about what's correct, what arguments work, which ones don't, and so forth, that we have to remember that arguments never occur in a vacuum. That there's always that people are advocating to someone, or to a general audience, depending, and that there's an understanding with intellectual work that when you put your work out there, then it's subject to scrutiny and critique, and that's how we vet things, But people aren't deriving anything from anything except insofar as they're trying to affirm something or negate something. And accordingly, the real reason why say normative arguments aren't less concrete, real, or more arbitrary or something than other kinds of arguments is because all arguments are subject to that same double bind mechanics. If you double bind yourself, you're fucked.